My name is David. I'm heading Innovation and Ventures with Mekorot, the National Water Company of Israel. We've been focusing on three key areas. First is investments, actually, investments in startups. There was a government resolution a year ago that enables Mekorot to invest in startups. We've invested in 5 technologies, startups, Israeli startups, which I'll be happy to share with you guys. The second avenue that we are operating in is research, applied research. We are working with most of the universities and research centers in Israel, but also abroad. We are part of consortiums such as BERD, the American-Israeli Bilateral Fund. We are quite active with the European Union, with Horizon 2020, Ultimate, and so on. We know some of you guys through one of our projects. So applied research is also a focus. And the third one is our internal innovation. There's a lot of brain power in Mekorot, 80 years of experience, and we are also developing in-house technologies and ventures. So that's my take. Who wants to be next? Steve, do you want to go next?
Sure. I'm Steve Close. I'm a chemist. And I started my career doing membrane research and development, like reverse osmosis and other membranes. And then I became a membrane technology leader for General Electric when they had a water business. It's now part of Suez business. I got shipped over to Asia in the mid-2000s to set up GE's R&D center in Shanghai. So I lived there. And then I also built a water R&D center for GE in Singapore. Then moved back to the US, became part of GE's venture capital team, and now I'm with True North Venture Partners. We're an investment firm that invests in water and energy and sustainability overall. Thank you.
Brilliant. Robert?
Yes, okay, I'll go next. I'm Robert Owens, and I'm the business development manager for Bechtel's water and pipeline business line. So everything that has to do with water treatment or conveyance of oil, gas, or water falls into our business line. I started my career in Schlumberger, so I'm really an oil and gas engineer, but I was a hydraulic fracturing engineer at the very beginning. So that was my first exposure to water. And of course, that's become more relevant in the last few years with what's gone on in unconventional production, which is part of where we focus. We generally look at desalination, industrial water treatment, and in some instances, treatment of liquid nuclear waste. And so those are the areas in which we're often looking for new opportunities. I'm based in Santiago, Chile, because here we work in the mining sector. And the largest project we have at the moment is a water delivery system for one of the largest copper mines in the world here in Chile. We built a previous one in very much the same model with desalination and water conveyance. And so that's really the core of our business these days is fresh water supply for industrial customers.
Interesting. Who wants to go next?
I can go next.
Yeah.
My name is Zach Fenster. Nice to meet you all and be on this virtual panel. I'm the VP of Business Development and Governmental Relations at WaterGen. WaterGen is the global leader in AWG solutions, or drinking water that comes from the air. We are an Israeli-based company with an Israeli-developed solution, but operating around the world in order to make sure that people have access to their human right of clean drinking water without fear of disease or infection, and doing so through this unique patented technology that we have to create drinking water from the air. I'll just very quickly mention about myself. Was born and raised in New York City. I've been living in Israel for the last decade, and actually approached and really became interested in water and drinking water actually through regional issues. My background is in Middle Eastern studies and Arabic. And through those studies and also my military service here, it became clear, what a huge issue water and drinking water is regionally and of course globally as well. So with WaterGen, led by our ownership and leadership here, it's been a great pleasure to be able to work in the region and around the world in order to bring this technology to everyone who needs it. Great to be with you all today.
Brilliant.
Yeah, I'll go next. My name is Eli. I'm the CEO of Utilis. I like Steve opening. He said he's a chemist and then everything else. Well, he's an investor, consultant. You have done so many things. So I'm a salesman. Yes. Of course, I have an engineering degree and I have a law degree and business degree, but at the essence, I'm a salesman. Taking technologies into the market. Utilis is using Earth observation technology. Specifically, we're using satellite data, SAR data. SAR stands for synthetic aperture radar. So we are using signals of radar to detect moisture in the ground. It's being used for the overall engineering market. Water in the ground or soil moisture cause a lot of damages. Specifically in the water utility markets, we are detecting leaks. We are also operating in the ground engineering market. We are detecting landslides and sinkholes, and we help railways owners and roads owners to better detect possible issues and maintain the infrastructure. In the water market, we are a leak detection technology. We are using the SAR data to understand where the leaks are, and we provide maps, GIS layers for water utilities to identify their leaks. We are probably the most efficient leak detection method exists today on Earth. And considering the two steps of leak detection, which are pinpointing, we are not a pinpointing technology, we are a zoning technology. So zoning means we are detecting a possible leak within an area, and the utility or the customers would usually go with the pinpointing technology to pinpoint the location. Our perspective is the water utility market. So unlike, for example, WaterGen that can sell to multiple type of customers, we are focusing on water utilities. Those are the entities that are responsible to bring the water in a high quality, high pressure, 24/7 to the consumers. And we are well experienced for the last 5 years. We are well experienced in selling to those entities which are heavily regulated, and they are coming with a package of attributes that makes the sales cycle be very unique and very challenging. So we can talk about it when it comes to that and how does it influence investment in technology and in innovation in this market.
Okay, so I'd like to keep it very fluid, right? Freestyle. We would love to hear your agenda, your thoughts, your philosophy in general, but also trying to focus on investments. I've seen that just in the last 3 months, GWI issues were focusing a lot on investments. It seems, from my perspective, that there is some sort of a boom in all sorts of investment funds and vehicles, even in early stage. And I'm not sure if it's from my perspective or it's because of there is I don't know if you're aware, but there's this peace accords with the Emirates and Bahrain and the Gulf states, and something with this kind of evokes a lot of activities around water investments. But just if we look at August, September, even October issues of GWI, we've seen some reports and some articles about these funds. There's Emerald and Upwell and Burnt Island Ventures, and those are just examples for funds that launched in the past few months. And my question is this a part of a global change in the water economics that kind of justify investing in those vehicles and accelerating the investment in water technologies? Does the paradigm shifted a little bit? Is there a new economics that we should be aware that justified setting up funds as opposed to the past that water investment were considered very let's call it slow and without great ROI? What do you think, Steve? Do you wanna address it?
Sure, I can talk about that. So water investments still, I think, are probably a little bit difficult compared to a lot of other sectors, but there's positive change, and the pace of attractiveness of water as a sector is definitely going up. And I think it's a few things. Water rates are continuing to rise around the world, and when they tend to rise, they tend to go up in big step changes, driven by scarcity and so on. I think we're seeing a bigger understanding that there's a link between climate change and water. So water is a part of climate change. And to address climate change, water's got to be addressed as well. There's also a bigger understanding of the one water concept, that every water is the same water. And this is leading to a lot more like reuse. And I think we're seeing municipalities really start to think more holistically about their water strategies. And actually it gets pretty complex once you start to think about reuse at any significant degree, because generally when you reuse water, you're taking that from a wastewater plant. That wastewater treatment is essentially steady state, but water usage is not steady state. Water usage is, there's demand cycles throughout the day. And so when you go to higher proportions of reuse, there's even possible needs for storage that's needed. It's a lot more complex to manage an overall system with reuse in it. So the analytics, the sensors, the algorithms, those things are very important. And also, aging infrastructure that needs to get repaired or upgraded to be part of the solution. So I think because of the water rates rising, which is driven by all these things, the growing importance of water scarcity continuing with climate change to go up, it's driving more of a change. It's putting it more in the money and driving new solutions that are really more comprehensive solutions that weren't really so needed in the past.
Okay, interesting. Robert?
Yeah, I've got probably a good example of this, and I'm going to speak specifically about the industrial sector, because that's primarily where we work as an engineering construction firm. We follow oil and gas companies, mining companies to where their large projects are, and we're often either the engineer or sometimes the constructor or the construction manager. And I'll use Chile as an example because it's one I know so well, and we've seen such a change here in the last 10 years. We've had 10 years of consecutive drought. It's clear that climate change has had an enormous impact here on rainfall, temperatures, and what's happened in the last 8 years specifically, started by the largest mining companies, is that they demonstrated a willingness to pay to secure their water supply. So not only because they had access to less groundwater and surface water, the aquifers are declining, there's also the issue of larger populations in proximity to the mines, and so they have more competition for those scarce resources. And so the largest and most profitable mines have been prepared to make really significant investments to make sure that they control their own water supply. And really the only way to do that, to be certain you're going to have more than enough than you need for your operations, is to do desalination. And most of the mines are 100 miles or so from the coastline here in Chile, in the northern half of the country. And so that means you need large conveyance systems as well. And so the combination has given us a really good business opportunity to do both. The trend we see globally, particularly in industries like petrochemicals and refining, is that the value that they place on cleaning up the wastewater or securing water supply to maintain their core business or their core process has increased. And so there's an increased willingness to pay for clean water, whether it's the intake water or the makeup water for what you're producing, which the best example here in Chile is, of course, copper. or cleaning up the wastewater that you're going to release either into the environment or dispose of in some other form. Maybe the best example is produced water in upstream oil and gas in places that have experienced huge production booms like the Permian Basin in Texas. But in general, there's much more sensitivity to securing in the industrial sector water supply and the cleanup of wastewater. And so those are the areas that we're focusing on for our traditional customers. And I think from a technology investment standpoint, what that does is create a lot of opportunity for process improvement. So for the sorts of technologies that Steve wants to invest in and that other companies are looking to develop, these sorts of projects presents an opportunity where a small improvement in something like membrane efficiency can have dramatic improvement, dramatic cost impact over the life of an asset. And these assets are $1 billion, or in some cases, a few $1 billion. And so those savings can be worth an awful lot of money, meaning the technology has great potential.
Okay. Watergen, Utilis, you guys are, you're bringing some sort of a disruptive technologies into the market. You're from the entrepreneur side. Is there you see more appetite from the market, from even from funds, from clients for your technologies?
I think I think what's clear is that the urgency has become much greater, right? And it's a question of finances, as you were discussing at the beginning, Dudi, but it's really the sense of urgency has become, and rightfully so, tremendous. And I think just to sort of pick up from where Steve and Robert left off, right? You have the effects of climate change, which are clearly limiting, evaporating, destroying, taking away our source of clean drinking water, just as demand is getting ever higher, right? And at the same time, the coronavirus crisis has also made people understand that the ability to guarantee and have independence around your own clean drinking water sources or your core resources, as Robert was saying, is absolutely critical. I mean, to just take it off the topic of water for 1 second, but who would have thought that, if a year ago someone had said that you'd show up at the supermarket and there was no toilet paper or there was a run on food, right? Who would have believed it? No one would have believed it. So I think people are understanding and becoming extremely sensitive to the degree to which they can protect and guarantee their own most important resources, and water is, of course, the most primary among those. So I think what that leaves us with is a place where entrepreneurship, where technology and innovation can really, close gaps and make up leaps very quickly. And touching on what Robert said, so right, a lot of the countries that may even have long coasts still have sizable populations that are far away from those coastlines or that are far away from those water resources, and their infrastructure isn't up to the task, right? And they don't have the years and tens, if not hundreds of billions of dollars that it would take to upgrade or update those infrastructure systems. And you don't need to be a poor country, right? I mean, the United States has had a lot of bad press, right? And many other developed countries about what's in their pipes over the last few years. So what we're focused on at Watergen is basically filling in that circle and saying, through innovation, we've provided a technology that can guarantee the peace of mind that I think people are particularly looking for with the coronavirus crisis imminently, and with the planet change and climate crises that we unfortunately know will be faced in the coming years and decades.
I think that the perspective of technology innovation many times or often needs to be considered from the environment we are in general, specifically in the Israeli market. We all know that innovation is, or startup situation, it's a constant starvation of capital. That's the mode we are at all the time. We always need capital. We are in a constant mode of raising capital for our first stage. The environment that we are at is that when we are looking for capital, we are competing not with other water technologies, we are competing with other innovations in terms of cyber and fintech and all other general tech innovations. The VCs or the entity that invest with us, they are looking on all options and they are measuring what is the fastest route for growth. And for in that situation, being related to water means that it's going to be extremely difficult for you to compete in this environment. And specifically for utilities, as we are selling into water utilities, that's even worse. So first, we are a water company. Second, you are selling for those very slow entities that buy, basically they are buying pilot, moving from pilot to adoption takes years. So within a competitive environment of trying to raise capital from VCs in the startup nation area, it's like trying to win a race with one hand tied into your back and with one leg. So we don't really feel that money that comes into water really gives us an advantage in that area. We do hear a lot on impact investors. There are very few here in Israel right now. Impact investors are coming mostly with the same set of requests like any other VC. They want to see growth. They want to see all the other demands of other VCs. And the top, they want also to measure us either by ESG measurement or SDG, which means what is your impact and how do you measure your impact? And generally, there is a high ticket of going with impact investor in terms of valuation. So valuation is much lower compared to, so if you take any tech company with a certain revenue, the multiples will be much less going with an impact market. So the bottom line is it's very difficult to be an entrepreneur in the water sector, specifically if the market is water utilities, and it's quite difficult to be successful. But once a company is successful, it's a very sticky market and very reliable market. So the water utility market is very difficult in terms of penetration, but at the same time, it's very loyal to the technology that brings value to.
Okay. So building on that, I mean, would you say, I mean, we are witnessing quite a migration from technologies that are usually traditionally are not in water, technologies for enterprise software. You said cyber, but also a lot of kind of big data application, data mining, AI, machine learning, and so on.
I'll be first here, David. That's a typical behavior of the water sector. The water sector is a laggard. The early adoption has started, all of those technology, enterprise software, CRMs, ERPs, all of those management systems were introduced to the world 20, 25 years ago. Having the water utility or the water sector adopting those technologies only now shows that it's a good demonstration that it's a market that follow the adoption in terms of many, many years behind. A good example would be the way water utilities are using data. It's staggering to understand what is the amount of data that they hold. And at the same time, it is quite shocking to understand the way they are using this data. Okay, so when it comes to big data and AI, again, that's a slow adoption market. It's very, very needed. The value can be huge once it's adopted, but it takes much longer than any other market. And from investment point of view, investing in technologies that go into the, again, we are selling to water utilities. Water is a very wide area. So investing with technologies that's supposed to be adapted by water utilities comes with a very high ticket in terms of time and valuation.
You know, David, I'll just comment here. I think that's what Eli said is right. You know, water utilities are typically slow and pragmatic. I mean, for a utility director at a water utility, if they adopt a new technology and it works great, they're not going to get a huge bonus, more shares in the company. They're not going to get, you know, that. But if it goes wrong, they're going to get fired. So there's very little upside and there's a tremendous amount of downside. So it's really regulatory and other things that can put pressures on to drive change. I think the issue for startups are, and I'd sort of love to hear from Zach on this, is that, you know, finding your entry market is so important. The stuff Robert talked about was industrial, but that's billion-dollar industrial. You know, an unproven startup, I don't think Bechtel is going to say, hey, let's try it. You know, your serial number one as the cornerstone technology in this billion-dollar job. But there are places typically with all that's happening in water and industrial and other sectors where you can find that niche to get started. And then the stuff that Eli's talking about, these utilities are massive opportunities. They're slow, but he's right. It is sort of a promised land that you want to end up at the end of the day. It just takes a little bit of time. So you have to seed those a little bit while trying to find an entry market to get going, to get the validations, to begin the market migration process, to go for the big jobs that Robert and Utilis and utilities are talking about. But I'm just kind of curious, Zach, on your market entry and where you see your markets for your AWG.
It's a great question. And, you know, what immediately it made me think of was that at an earlier time, I mean, right now, WaterGen, I would say, is way beyond the startup phase. And, you know, we're operating in more than 60 countries around the world, have 4 international manufacturing sites. You know, we're operating on every continent, and we're fortunate to be able to be growing our impact all the time. But still, you know, there is an element that almost sounds, there's an element of WaterGen's product that almost sounds like it's out of science fiction, right? How do you create drinking water from nothing? And it is amazing, right? It is stunning, although as a chemist, Steve, and anyone who's familiar with either heat exchangers or, you know, with the weather, we know that we know that it makes a ton of sense and it's incredibly intuitive, right? And the leap that WaterGen was able to make was essentially to develop a technology where it could be scaled and brought to every, you know, home, office, and school. But what I would say is that we definitely, you know, at an earlier stage, it was very important, you know, we would have people come to our office and start trying to find the water hookup because they just couldn't believe it. I think now, with the increase in urgency and awareness around drinking water needs around the world, the profile of innovation and of WaterGen specifically has reached a point where it's something that people are more and more understanding is the solution. And I have to say also that because of the increased urgency, there's also, you know, rather than focus on a specific entry market, we've really been fortunate enough to have many people come to us, right? And it's really been about scaling our production, scaling our distribution and operation capacities in order to meet that demand. So that's been, you know, what we've been focused on. Luckily, we have an amazing owner and CEO who's put, you know, the full force of his abilities behind this company. And so we've been able to grow in leaps and bounds so that, you know, as I mentioned today, we are in more than 60 countries. 2 years ago, we had just launched our first commercial product. So the growth, I think, if you can tap into it, Steve, even though you're right, there might be some initial growing pains. The world is ready for these types of innovative solutions, and the world is hungry for them, or thirsty for them in this case. So if you show up, the sky's the limit.
I agree with you, Steve. The bridgehead strategy is probably the most important decision a startup would make in the water sector. And that's a live or die. If you make the wrong decision here, a huge amount of resources is just crashing on a huge wall. And it's quite difficult. Again, if the perspective is selling into the water agencies, the water utilities, it's very difficult to segment this market because they all look the same. You look on territories or on privatization versus public versus municipalities, agencies. At the end, they are all doing the same thing. They are working more or less under the same science. They are all buying the same pipes and they are all using the same meters. Very difficult to segment it. I think that you said an interesting thing. The right segmentation right now is by regulatory. The regulation is going to make a huge difference. And within a country that is more regulated versus lower regulation, there are differences between water utilities. So the bridges strategy on the regulatory is very, very important. And I would say that also there are areas, there are territories that the regulation is not very supportive, yet there are other factors that can be used, mainly ESG considerations. For example, working with the Development Bank in Latin America, EBRD in Eastern Europe, and others can make a big difference in penetrating a territory, penetrating a market without regulation.
Great. From our perspective, we've been meeting and actually partnering with the private sector, right? So you said there's the utilities and there's the regulatory regime and so on, but also an unexpected kind of backwind we've been seeing from big multinationals. So we've been partnering with Microsoft on a program to find technologies that are relevant for water. I know that they have a pledge that by 2030 they'll offset all of their water usage, and somehow we've seen a lot of appetite from them to get into the water sector. They have their water needs, and they're now investing through funds and through other means in water technologies. The same goes to Amazon. The chief innovation officer of Amazon was here on a visit. We hosted him for 2 days, and we've seen also their perspective. So there might be a new giant that might be interested in water that can push the market to new frontiers. So I don't know. What is your take on this? Do you see the private sector, the big players from other worlds, let's call it, getting their interest in water?
I'll just say I think absolutely. Sorry, Robert. Go ahead.
No, it's up to you, Steve. Go ahead, please. After you.
I think it relates to how big of a brand the companies are. If it's some company that nobody's heard of, they're not going to really care so much about their brand and their image and this stuff. But the firms that you named, and you can bring in the beverage companies, a Nestle, a Pepsi, or Coca-Cola as well, that are very concerned about their image. These firms, they tend to go to places and they pump water out of the ground, and they can, they need to be careful about it. So these firms also have a very big energy and overall sustainability plan that they have to carry out. And they're planning for a world where things are going to happen. I mean, change in regulatory behavior here, regulations and change are probably going to come at an accelerated pace as climate change goes up. And these companies are looking out for their future. Plus, they have to come across to the consumer as they're a very good brand. So being responsible, getting ahead of the game, it's in their vested company interest to do that. I mean, look at what's happened to the coal companies and the oil companies. Like, it's very difficult now in industries that aren't getting ahead of the game. And I think it makes total logical sense. They're very serious. They're very real. It's not just saying stuff and greenwashing. They're very serious about their water sustainability and being able to show and say that their water is sustainable. I mean, even CO2 now, ExxonMobil and others like want to take, lawsuits against these folks or look at other environmental pollution, but way after the fact, lawsuits come again. These companies want to be clean. They want to do things right. They've got an image to hold up. And so I think it's very serious, very real.
I think I can add a bit to that, Steve. And some of our customers, when I talk about oil and gas companies and mining, are even more water intensive than tech companies. Obviously, for water is a big part of the business for something like Coca-Cola, but it's an equipment business in bottling plants. Whereas for something like the mining sector, the volumes are massive in a single location. And of course, the wastewater they produce is a lot more toxic probably than anything that comes out in liquid form from a bottling facility. And so those community issues are maybe even more severe because the potential to cause harm is much higher. And so there's concentrated investment by these companies now, and they're rushing into it to ensure that they can put a good face on everything they're doing. I mean, much like what the companies you mentioned in the tech sector, but they're recognizing that there's a much more significant downside. And maybe a very good example would be wastewater in the mining sector, because that's essentially what tailings are when you have these very large tailings dams. And of course, when they fail, the world knows. And that's happened a few times in the last few years. And of course, the results are catastrophic. And ultimately, that's an issue of wastewater, because that water could be reused and those tailings could be dry, and that sort of situation could be avoided. And there's a lot more money that's going to go into those areas to try and do that very quickly in the next few years. We act really as a buyer of some of these sorts of technologies and looking at opportunities like that to dry stack tailings and remove the risk associated with having huge volumes of dirty water sitting somewhere in the world, especially when it's nearby a community. You're right that first of a kind is a four-letter word for us, because the downside loss to an oil and gas company if something fails and their operations are affected, of course, can be huge. And so we're not looking to deploy first of a kind technologies. And we get offered a lot of opportunity, a lot of things, right? People come with all sorts of ideas to us, recognizing that we can put them into facilities around the world. We do sometimes pursue them, and the ones that we work with and sometimes co-invest with are often the ones that are tested, right? Not necessarily at a commercial scale, but they have a pilot plant and they've invested some significant effort in proving it out, not simply the concept that they're looking for an investor in, because we're usually acting in between an end user like an oil and gas company or a mining company and the technology provider. You have to convince the engineering company first, and then the engineering company can go to the end user and say, look, we think this is the right way to adjust the process, and it's reliable and it's proven, in this particular pilot plant, and we can see it somewhere else. And at that point, the platform is there with a company like Bechtel or any one of our peers to take the new technology and really launch it around the world, because we can immediately insert it into things all over the world. But it's often a matter of how well proven the technology is at the pilot scale. Let's say if someone brings us a pilot plant and it works well, and we can go through it ourselves and use wastewater often is what we're most interested in, and see that it works, we can quickly go and represent it, as we do occasionally, to our very large end user industrial customers, and that's the way we can get it out to the world quite quickly. And so I think I would offer that engineering and construction companies like us can be platforms to launching some of these new technologies very quickly into particularly industrial sectors, but probably also municipal sectors in some instances.
Does Bechtel has a venture capital or some sort of investment vehicle that you have?
We do. We wouldn't describe it as a venture capital group, but we have what's called Bechtel Enterprises. Typically, they invest in development or co-developing infrastructure projects. In some instances, and we've had one or two in the last couple of years, we will co-invest in things like water technologies to get them up to a scale at which we can launch them. And it has to be something that's quite special. We have to see the market opportunity, but it certainly happens. We're probably more conservative than a venture capital firm in that sense. It has to be something that we see an immediate application for with an existing customer. But it's certainly happening. And I'd say it's happening more frequently because of the recognition by our customers that they need to secure their water supply and also clean up their dirty water. And so we're looking for those opportunities as well.
David, I just want to add something quickly about this point on the regulation. I think it's a super interesting point. And I think it applies more and more, not only to, wastewater itself or water itself, but a lot of water adjacent industries and technologies. For example, plastic bottling and containers, right? I think, as from our perspective at WaterGen, we see consumer confidence in tap water plummeting. There's also, particularly in developed economies, but not only, tremendous sensitivity to sustainability, ecological and environmental issues, right? And we're seeing the regulation begin to meet that, right? So there's increasing legislation. Some's already passed in California, in Canada. There's some pending in the EU around the banning of single-use plastics, right? And I think that really is probably actually catching up to consumer sentiment that's already a lot further ahead. So what we are doing at WaterGen is saying that these ecological issues, these climate issues, and these health issues really are sort of one, right? And if you, through innovation, right, can come up with a solution that not only provides the resource that you need, right, in this case, water, but also does so in a way that is decentralized and is independent, you can also begin to wean yourself off of some really environmentally dangerous practices, not only in terms of plastics in this particular case, but also in terms of extremely carbon intensive processes, be they long supply chains, drilling, building, et cetera, which has all sorts of repercussions for natural ecosystems. So I think regulation is going to be an issue that's more and more focused on and driving sort of the market's path and technology's path. And just to give, our example, we have in the beginning of 2021, our first consumer unit, right, that's coming out that is really designed for homes and offices. Up until this point, we've had devices that are much bigger, they produce between hundreds and thousands of liters per day. But now, we've seen where the market is going. We've seen where the consumer base, what the consumer base is really asking for. And we're bringing to the market a product called the Jenny, which will enable people to create their own drinking water in their own homes and without needing to get, big 5-gallon jugs or store for an emergency hurricane or something like that. Tons of bottles of drinking water in their homes. So I think regulation, innovation, and investment are really sort of all different parts of the same big coin that's driving new technologies.
Thank you.
Touching back, David, to your question about the big tech companies and their influence on the water sector, we see them approaching through the aspect of smart cities. Utilis is dealing with the distribution network of water, and in some places it's part of the municipalities, in other places it is somehow related to the municipalities. And there will be a point that the smart city technology will take or handle the distribution system as well. It's still very early. Smart cities technology are now handling more like traffic and lightning and more basic issues. But one day it will come also to the water. And as you are putting, all of those technologies are always deal with GIS, Geographical Information System, means that it's a layer of data sitting on another layer of data on a map. Taking care of this infrastructure is also something that needs to be managed. So that's where we see Microsoft, Cisco, Google, all of them are highly interested in that area, in the water distribution through that aspect. But I think it's going to take much longer before the smart city technology will handle that. You have mentioned earlier the oil and gas market, and I think that this is a good example on maybe asking what would happen to the oil and gas market if it would have been managed the way water distribution systems are managed. It will be a pile of disasters, one on the top of each other. So I think there is a big difference between the way oil and gas market is looking on the infrastructure than the water, and the core reason is the cost of the unit or the value of the unit. So maybe it will make sense to discuss a little bit about what does it cost to consume 1 liter or 1 gallon of water compared to any other natural resource, and why we are where we are in terms of aging infrastructure and not functioning utilities.
Interesting. So another thought. Water is part of almost any ecosystem, and we're seeing agri-tech that is quite booming. I don't know if the business model there is quite clear, and there are people that are willing to pay for agriculture technologies because they understand the economics and the yields and so on. And on the other hand, we see energy. So energy companies and also wants to innovate and invest a lot in technologies. And in between, there's the water sector somehow, which is related to these two disciplines, but to many more. And do you think that because those area fluctuates, I mean, that they will kind of elevate the water sector into kind of similar playing ground? Is this something that resonates? If in other disciplines the investment rises, will water elevate to the same height, like water usually do?
I don't think so.
No?
I think, allow me to be the first one on this one. I think that the last point that I mentioned, the cost of the unit is disrupting the overall supply chain. It doesn't make sense to grow watermelon in the desert of Israel by pushing the water all the way from the north. Huge amount of gallons are going into one watermelon that needs to be exported to Europe. And basically what we are exporting is financed water by the government. That's what we are exporting. It simply doesn't make sense. Now, since the overall supply chain is broken, the cost of water doesn't really reflect the real value of water, and it's perceived to be free by everyone, okay? And there is huge amount of politics around putting pressure on the government to provide water to agriculture, although it doesn't make sense economically. All those points will never get together into one cohesive, makes sense economical structure. So until we fix the fundamental problem of the water sector, the cost of gallon, which it's not an easy thing. I mean, it's highly political. Until we understand that bringing fresh water 24/7 in a high quality and a high pressure to our house is an almost mission impossible, and we stop taking it for granted, then maybe we will start to see things working together in one structure of economy.
What we're seeing in industrial sectors, and it's very much related to what you just said, and I very much like the example of the watermelon export, because it's something we think about for a bit, but it's an increasing willingness to pay for clean water. And that's happening, not surprisingly, quickly in industrial sectors, the ones I've talked about, because without fresh water in the right place, you can't drill your oil well, you can't frack your oil well, you can't produce copper, or you can't run your core business. And of course, the opportunity cost for that is very, very high. And so in some places and in some industries, they can very quickly quantify what is the willingness to pay for water, and it's much higher than a typical individual consumer would say they value a liter of water at, because otherwise their core business is at risk. I think it's going to take much longer for consumers to recognize that water has tremendous value, because without it you can't survive. And if you happen to live in a water scarce place, whether it's a major city where resources are just scarce, you haven't probably been paying a market price fair value for that water up until now, but that's what you think it's worth. So in the future, if you're asked to pay multiples of that, it's going to take a very long time for people, particularly municipal users and consumers, to get used to the fact that it has to be a market and you'll have to pay the market price. And if you live in a very dry city like Sao Paulo or Mexico City or somewhere where there's constant shortage, you need to be prepared to pay more, and people will be very resistant to that. I think the reason we're having success in industrial sectors is because industrial consumers can react very quickly, recognizing that without the water they have no business. We're prepared to pay more, and we'll do so very quickly. But for consumers, it's going to take a generation.
I don't know. I mean, I think one way in which it can happen very quickly is, as Eli was saying, there's this warping of the market. One of the ways that it's warped is that we don't really. You were discussing the one water system or one water, and it's true. But on the other hand, we need very, very different levels of water quality for different human activities, right? Mm-hmm. And yet on the consumer level, if you're talking about it, right? I mean, we've been trained, I think particularly in the West, to think that, like all of our water needs to be the same quality, the water that's in our toilets, the water that's coming out of our sinks, and the water that is, that we're putting into our bodies. And it's silly, right? And I think one way to actually come toward the consumer, and this is what we're doing at WaterGen, is saying, you actually, the highest quality water that you need is, of course, the water that you consume.
Yes.
The water that you're going to use for doing your laundry or flushing your toilet or even planting your crops can actually be of a much lesser quality, and therefore can be placed at a different price point if we're going to get into the sort of economic modeling of it. So I think when you begin to segment water consumption, right, and with those segments, you can also begin to delineate between the different qualities of water that those segments need. It's one way to begin reimagining how our sort of whole water ecosystem and whole water consumption can begin to change. And then when you focus on drinking water solutions, and that's just what we're focused on at WaterGen, so that's my primary focus. Our solution is incredibly affordable when we look at the per liter value and how it compares to other solutions that offer high quality water. I mean, again, a bottle of mineral drinking water is exorbitantly expensive even today, right? Even with our sort of skewed and warped market. And so I think by differentiating and again introducing these new technologies, there's actually a way in which we don't necessarily need to educate the consumer to pay more for water, but we need to educate the consumer to be smarter about where they're paying their dime, where they're putting their dime, and investing in higher quality versus poorer quality water.
Yes, excellent point. I mean, there certainly are some distortions between what people expect to pay for their tap water at home in a developed market versus what they're prepared to pay for a bottle of water at the gas station. Right. And so that I don't think people rationalize it very well, but it's something that
they don't think about it.
People have. Yeah, that's right.
It's probably one of the biggest ripoffs in the history of humankind. What we pay for bottled water is 1,000 times more expensive than water that we can get from the tap.
For sure.
In most countries, much better in terms of quality and availability than. So, Robert, back to you. I think it's a marketing issue. I said at the beginning that I'm a salesman. So it's how you sell it to people. It's not. Yeah. It's not. Just think of the situation. I mean, I've seen it in water utilities. David is coming from Mekorot. I'll tell you something about the way Mekorot is marketing itself. There are for more than anything else, they're in a defense mode. They always need to apologize. They are under constant attack by the citizens because they sell the water in a high price, they don't provide service and so on. Instead of marketing themselves as the hero of the country, we are the suppliers of the most important what any person would start with. I mean, this is the basic in the Maslow. We're the supplier. Look what we're doing for you. We're providing you 24/7, high quality, high pressure water. And instead of using each and every disaster as a way to build themselves as the hero, they are automatically going into apologetic situation. So marketing water utilities as the hero of the public should be the start. And then they will be able to justify tripling or even 10 times the cost of water, and people will start to use it in a smart way. Just
brilliant. I'll convey it to the board of directors. That's a very passionate manifest. I guess one of the biggest achievement that Mekorot has been able to do is detach, or the state of Israel detach itself from climate. So the dependence on climate. So we are extracting 80% of drinking water from sea desalination, and we are reusing 90% of the water, the wastewater that we treat. We use them for agriculture. So once we've managed to allocate this massive proportions from sea desalination and wastewater treatment to these big demands, we are kind of in a good state, and there's a big circular economy philosophy going on here that we're using the water several times.
There is a huge difference between how the international water market perceives Mekorot and its innovation, and how the Israeli population perceives Mekorot and the cost and the regulation and so on. So that's where I think that we need to fix it. What you are doing here in Israel is no less than a miracle, where the population is still complaining on cost of water and availability, and why you are increasing the cost for agriculture versus others.
Yeah. Yeah, and then on an optimistic note, I guess this new Middle East, the new peace accords and so on, there's a big potential here to drive water across the Middle East, one of the most distressed water places in the world. So if you take our access to the Mediterranean, to the sea, and our network of pipes, and then you connect it to our neighbors through Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, and so on, you can start moving water like oil in the Middle East, and there's a lot of potential now in creating some sort of a bridge in that sense. Not only harnessing our technologies and experience, but also the real infrastructure and providing more water to the region. So this is something that we are quite looking forward to. Any other issues, points that you wanna raise before we wrap up?
Maybe I'll just say, I think something interesting that's happening too is Robert's mentioning desalination, like in Chile. We're seeing the price of desalination drop, and I think there's a couple reasons. One is a lot of technologies are somewhat understood. The engineering firms are very good at coming up with solutions. And number two is renewable energy, solar, for example, is being used much more to power desalination. So that's driving down electricity costs and making it more sustainable. So we're seeing those benefits come in. And as water gets more and more in the money because of this water stresses, all the issues we're talking about here, the legacy practices have not been smart, efficient, and they're sort of a lot of paper and pen documentation of things, sort of very simplistic legacy practices. And there's a lot of opportunity for digital and automation and new technologies to come in that have to come in, frankly, to be part of the solution. So I think we're at the beginning of a neat little dawn of an age coming in for water to grow in importance. It's maybe still not as big of a deal as and as attractive as an investment sector as we'd all like, but it's better than it was before, and the future's looking good.
Nice.
You know, even before the peace accords, it was actually desalination that was one of the things that were huge commonalities between Israel, and we've discussed the sort of sophistication of the Israeli market and states in the Gulf, right? I mean, they on both sides of the coin, both in terms of investment and in terms of dependency, it's Israel and Gulf states that have been leading the world in terms of adoption to desalination. And yet still we see, right, for desalination to work, you know, Israel is in this case, luckily, a very small and new country, right? And hooking up all of Israel to infrastructure systems that ultimately connect to desal plants is not the same as doing so for the United States or doing so for China, or even doing so for the greater Levant. David, I hope that the case is correct, and soon there will be initiatives to bridge Israel, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq and elsewhere with, you know, piping. But, you know, that's tens, if not hundreds of billions and trillions of dollars. That's years, right? There, for example, is a long history of shared agreements between Israel, the PA, and Jordan around big infrastructure solutions like that, which, you know, the difference between what appears on the paper and what's actually been done in practice is pretty wide. So I think we also need to recognize, and we see, you know, the Gulf, even before the peace agreements, was one of the markets where we received the most interest, exactly because of the need and despite the investment in desalination, right? And so I think it's important to realize that, especially in today's day and age, right, being able to invest when governments are strapped for cash, right, and there's no time to lose, you need immediate solutions that are quickly deployable. Desal is, of course, an incredibly important technology, but the fact of the matter is that it can't be deployed tomorrow in places where it's not already set up. So I think that's important to keep in mind. And particularly another part of, you know, climate change being discussed is emergencies and crises, right? This is another area where with solar energy, with rapid deploy solutions, right, you can get to places that are completely off grid, right, in the blink of an eye, with technologies like water gen, with solar energy, with battery energy, etc. That long-term infrastructure projects, you know, as critical as they are, can't access.
Maybe one last historical point. More than 3,000 years ago, I think it was probably 4,000 years ago, the nation of Israel left Israel down to Egypt because of a drought. Because the Nile was the biggest water supply source in the whole region. Now that the Nile is not enough for the Egyptian, it's going to be very interesting if we will provide the Egyptians some desalinated water, and that's going to close a very nice loop over 4,000 years.
Yeah, I think they're building one of the biggest one in the world now, but a desalination plant. But that's a brilliant notion.
Yep.
And yeah, there's a lot more to discuss. We haven't got into depth with the real technologies, going into details, but I guess we can leave it for next time. It was a real pleasure having you guys.